It's the holiday season again, and if you're a new vegan, tackling Thanksgiving as a vegan can be a real issue. To make things easier, I've compiled some of my favorite vegan side dishes, along with vegan cheesy appetizers and pumpkin pie. I'll post chapters in the description box below, that way you can jump to whichever recipe works for you. Let's dive in.
These remarkably easy-to-make cheeses require no fancy ingredients, just a handful of pantry staples and your trusty blender. I start by soaking my cashews. If you have a high-powered blender, you can skip this step. After draining the cashews, I toss them into a blender with all of the other ingredients. Don't overlook the miso paste. Its fermented taste really elevates the flavor of this cheese to new heights. Thankfully, it's available in most grocery stores today. Give the blender a good scrape and keep on blending until all of the ingredients are incorporated and the mixture is smooth. The cheese goes into the refrigerator overnight. This will set the cheese. I'd like to use a nut milk bag, but multiple layers of cheesecloth would also be effective. The cheese comes out of the fridge and you can see that it is now firm. You could lightly reshape the cheese if you like. And I'm just pressing in some chopped fresh parsley. Fresh dill would also be a great topping. The flavor is a symphony of garlicky, cheesy goodness and rich indulgence. The next cheese is the baked feta. This cheese has a more mellow flavor and a firm, crumbly texture. Again, all of the ingredients go into a blender. We're starting with almond flour. If you make your own almond flour and save the remaining almond powder, you could definitely use that. This recipe is refreshingly simple with only a handful of ingredients. It comes together in a flash, making it convenient and time-saving. This cheese must go into the refrigerator overnight to drain out the liquids and make the cheese more firm. I am once again putting this cheese into a nut milk bag. You could also use cheesecloth if you like. Some liquid will drain from this cheese, so be sure to put it into a container that allows the liquid to drain freely. I'm simply using a bowl with a mesh strainer. I estimate that just over a tablespoon of liquid drained out of my cheese. Now it's time to bake the feta. Transfer the cheese to a baking sheet with a silicone baking mat or parchment paper. The feta is still pretty soft at this point. You would be able to shape it however you like. While this cheese recipe is truly delectable, it isn't my creation. The link to the original recipe is in the description box. The cheese bakes for about 40 minutes or until it begins to crack. Once the cheese comes out, you could serve it hot or place it into the fridge to cool for a while. The texture will be softer when served hot. To enhance the flavor, I've prepared a simple topping consisting of warmed extra virgin olive oil and fresh chopped parsley and dill. These cheeses are undoubtedly worth the effort, and I must say, I've yet to find store-bought cheeses that compare in flavor. This herb-filled stuffing is moist, flavorful, and gluten-free. I start by chopping onion and celery. I heat up a large skillet, and once it's hot, I add a stick of butter and allow that to melt. Then I add the onion and celery and allow that to saute until soft. I'm saving the scraps from the onion, celery, and garlic. I put them in a freezer bag and save them until I have enough to make a stock. Check out my short on making veggie broth that is very flavorful, super easy, and cheap. While the onions and celery are cooking, I'm going to mince my garlic. The garlic goes in for a couple of minutes, then I add my seasonings. I like to toast the herbs for a minute or two to bring out the flavor. I'm mostly using dried seasonings today. Let's be real, not everyone has access to fresh herbs, and they do cost more than the fresh alternative. I'll give the amounts for both fresh and dried herbs in the show notes below. Separately, I'm cooking a plant-based sausage. This variety is spicy. The sausage isn't required for this dish, but it does add a great deal of depth of flavor to the stuffing. I'm using 12 cups of dried bread in this recipe. I always prefer to use a combination of breads. Today I'm using 3 different types. 2 are loaves that I previously made and then froze portions. The last is a sliced white bread, all gluten-free. You can really use any bread that you enjoy. Dried or stale bread should be used in stuffing. There are 2 options here. Either cube or hand tear the bread and leave it on a tray overnight to allow it to harden. Or place a cubed or hand-torn bread on a baking sheet and dry it out in the oven at 300 degrees for 30 minutes. The stale bread goes into a large bowl with a handful of fresh parsley. I then add the cooked onions, celery, and sausage. These next 2 ingredients are very optional. I use walnuts or pecans to add more of a texture to the dish. You really don't taste the nuts. I also add dried fruit. Today I'm using dried cranberries. I also like dried cherries or apricots. This adds a touch of sweetness to every bite. After adding the salt, the broth goes in. I'm using veggie broth that I made, but you can use whichever broth you like. Unfortunately, my camera shut off while adding the broth. I also buttered a large Pyrex baking dish to prevent sticking. The stuffing is covered with aluminum foil and baked for 45 minutes. I then remove the foil and cook for another 15 minutes. The final dish should have some crunchy bits at the top and a more moist stuffing underneath. Check out my channel for more holiday recipes.
This mushroom gravy is easy to make and comes together pretty quickly.
I start by sautéing chopped onion in neutral oil. I'm using a pound of mushrooms in this gravy. However, you could easily use less. It really depends on if you want a more creamy or a more chunky gravy. The cleaned mushrooms can be cut in a variety of ways. I actually enjoy larger mushroom pieces, so that's what I'm using today. However, you could absolutely cut them in thin or thick slices, or chop them if you want a gravy with little to no chunks. Mushroom and garlic go in next. I'm going to allow the mushrooms to cook for about 5 minutes until they are fully cooked. They will shrink during the cooking process. I also want to release all the liquids from the mushrooms. Soon I will add the other ingredients. The purpose of each ingredient is to add as much umami flavor as I can. Any of these ingredients can be left out if you don't like them or if you have a tight budget. I do, however, recommend using the seasonings if possible. Again, we're trying to build as much flavor as we can here. The seasonings go in and toast for a minute, then I add the flour. The flour is used today as a thickener. I'm using a gluten-free flour, but regular flour works even better. We want the flour to cook for a couple of minutes to remove any of the raw flour flavor. When it comes to the liquids in this gravy, the wine can be completely left out if you like. Just use more broth. I highly recommend using broth over water as the broth also adds to the complexity. After adding the first liquid, be sure to scrape the bottom of the pan. We want to pull up all of those tiny stuck-on pieces because they are full of flavor. I'm adding dried mushrooms, white miso paste, soy sauce, and balsamic vinegar. Then the broth goes in. By the way, you do not taste the soy sauce or the miso paste in this recipe. They are added to build a complex flavor. I'm using a vegetable broth that I made. Check out my short on making a broth using kitchen scraps. You really want to use the best broth that you can for this dish. While a house-made broth isn't required, it really does make a much better gravy. A store-bought broth or bouillon would also work. I like to allow my gravy to simmer for an additional 10 minutes or so. This will give the flavor time to develop and allow the gravy to thicken. One thing you will notice me not adding today is salt. The soy sauce and miso paste do have a good bit of sodium, and if you are concerned with the amount of sodium, feel free to use less or none of the soy sauce or miso paste. Once the gravy is finished, I like to add a bit of milk or cream and a tablespoon of butter. The butter gives the gravy a shiny finish. When the gravy is finished, you could serve it as is, or you could blend it. I prefer the gravy unblended personally, but if you do choose to blend the gravy, be aware that you will have to add additional liquid or it will be very thick. This gravy is not only good on mashed potatoes and other holiday foods, but goes well on top of a piece of crusty bread or a baked potato. Making great baked potatoes is very simple. Check out my baked potato short if you'd like some tips. Cranberry sauce is so easy to make and much better than that canned stuff. The cleaned cranberries go into a small pot. Add water and some OJ. Throw in the sugar. Cook until it's thick. Add some seasonings to warm up the flavor. Enjoy.
These Brussels sprouts are savory with a touch of heat and sweetness. They are so delicious, we just can't get enough. I'm using 1.5 pounds of Brussels in this recipe. After cleaning, I like to dry them thoroughly. Cutting them in half, removing the bottom portion, and taking off any leaves that are brownish. They go into a bowl with neutral oil and salt and then into the oven. While they cook, I'll make the miso glaze. The glaze includes maple syrup, white miso paste, available in most grocery stores these days, red pepper flakes, optional but highly recommended, and lemon juice. This sauce really elevates the flavor of the Brussels sprouts. Someone told me that even people who don't like Brussels would like these Brussels. I take the Brussels out when they have softened and start to become golden. I like to mix the Brussels and the sauce in a bowl. Be sure that each piece is covered in the sauce. And back into the oven they go. They only need about 8 to 10 more minutes in the oven. However, if you like your Brussels very crispy, then cook a few minutes longer. I like to finish the Brussels with additional red pepper flakes. Another squeeze of lemon would be nice as well. Check out my channel for more delicious recipes. This Hashbrown Casserole is so cheesy, so creamy, you'd never believe it's vegan. In this dish, I want to finely chop onion pieces and finely chop bell pepper pieces. These veggies aren't being pre-cooked, so if you like these pieces to be a bit crunchy in the casserole, then just chop them a little bit bigger. I usually use a red bell pepper, just to add some color, but I had a yellow one today. I'm always looking for ways to add some extra nutrients to my family's food, and the color of the spinach really gives this dish some contrast. I always like to keep a bag of spinach in the freezer. Spinach freezes really well. I just take a handful out whenever it's needed. These are frozen shredded hash browns. The ingredients are potatoes, which I like. You could grate your own if you want. For the cheese sauce, I'm making a quick roux, which is just equal parts of melted butter and flour used to make a sauce. In this case, I'm using gluten-free flour, which works just as well as the full gluten flour. And I'm adding seasonings. This is onion powder, garlic powder, smoked paprika, and salt. We just cook the roux for a couple of minutes while constantly mixing. This is so that the raw flour flavor cooks out. I'm now adding some plant milk. This one is an almond oat mixture, but you can use whichever milk you like. I add the milk slowly, otherwise the temperature of the pan will lower very rapidly and the roux will become clumpy. A whisk is a good tool for incorporating liquid into the roux. As soon as the mixture begins to thicken, I'm adding the cheese. I'm using the entire 7-ounce bag, but holding back about half a cup for the topping. I'm a minimalist, but people buy me things and I love those people, so I use them, including this kind of ridiculous automatic pepper grinder. Love you, Papa. Once the cheese is melty, I add the vegan sour cream. I totally love the sour cream because it actually tastes like sour cream and is made from white beans and oats. Look how thick and rich that sour cream is. Man, this sour cream is always on our grocery list because it's great on potatoes, great in potatoes, and I just love the flavor and the texture. Now the cheese sauce goes into the bowl with the potatoes, onions, pepper, and spinach. Mix well until everything is incorporated. This has made me think about all the times I've eaten homemade food from people who didn't think it was important to season. Please, people, season your damn food. I'm pouring this into a 13x9 Pyrex dish, smoothing it out and adding the remaining cheese. Covering it with aluminum foil assures it won't dry out. Into the oven it goes. When it comes out, it's creamy, cheesy, and so delicious. I am not lying when I tell you that my family ate it right up and there were no leftovers.
This perfect pumpkin pie is creamy and decadent. This recipe is for a deep dish pie pan and not the smaller ones that come from the grocery store. I start with canned pumpkin. Make sure that pumpkin is the only ingredient. This pie is very easy to make, and as far as I can tell, is foolproof. It has worked for me every single time. Then I add coconut cream, not coconut milk. The coconut cream has been left in the refrigerator overnight. This allows the liquid and the fat to separate. We scoop out the solid portion and the liquid does not go into the pie. Because this pie does not have eggs or a binder, we have to be very careful about not adding liquids if we want this to set. The next ingredient is sugar. The sugar helps the pie set up, and I would not use less. I've tested this recipe with a variety of brown sugar, white sugar, and raw sugar. In my opinion, the raw sugar works the best. Not only does the sugar give the pie structure, but the type of sugar affects the color of the pie. I also use cornstarch to firm up the pumpkin pie, and then the seasonings go in. Finally, I'm adding the vanilla. If you have visible pieces of coconut oil, don't be alarmed. The coconut oil will melt during the cooking process. I use an uncooked pie shell for this recipe. Because the pie is cooked for a long time, pre-cooking is not required. You can use any pie shell that you like, or check out my recipe for a gluten-free pie crust. The pie goes into the oven at 400 degrees for 15 minutes. I like to take the pie out at this point and add some decorations. This is definitely not required. But what else can you do with 2 tablespoons of leftover dough? The temperature goes down to 325 degrees and the pie goes back in. I start checking the pie at 45 minutes. We don't want the center to be wobbly. As you can see, it's pretty firm, but I know that it can firm up more, so I'm going back in for 10 more minutes. The pie is finally cooked. I leave it on the counter until it becomes room temperature, and then it goes into the refrigerator overnight.
Happy holidays from my family to yours.